Yes, Professor Vijay Raghavan, we can hear you. We're just trying to put you. Um, I think as this is being set up, I think again Professor Vijay Raghavan needs no introduction. He's a great institution builder. He was the director of NCBS, DBT secretary, principal scientific advisor. I mean, he needs no introduction, but above all, he has been a friend of the institute, Math Science. So, Professor Vijay Raghavan, very happy to have you. Looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for having me at this meeting. I would very much have liked to be there in person. So, what I will do briefly, I understand this is the last talk of the evening, and therefore I will be brief because I don't want to stand between you and your break. Um, I will just talk very briefly on how science, technology, and innovation in the 21st century looks like from an Indian perspective. And that Indian perspective has got two components. One, what has happened in India in the last 10 years, and what has happened in India in the past, in the 10 years preceding the last 10 years. So, overall, a 20-year period. And therefore, extrapolating both from what we are doing and, suggesting what changes we should respond to might give us a picture on how we are likely to be going ahead. Now, this will be brief, and I must stress that even though I've covered these two 10-year periods, which coincide with different governments, it is not meant to be a performance report on either of the two governments. It is meant to be a account of what science changes have taken place, correlated with the presence of the governments and functioning within those governments. And then that will give us a lesson as scientists on what we need to do going forward. And that lesson, I'll summarize very briefly before I start, is a simple one that unless we as scientists get involved in science administration, in addition to doing our science, and in addition to doing our science well, we will leave the course of science and technology impacting on the future of our planet in hands or on a ship without hands at the rudder. And you heard from Soumya how important questions we have faced and how important it is for scientists to get involved. So, this is also an exhortation for us to get involved in science administration, each in our own way. The only set of people who have the luxury, and they must have that luxury, of opining on every matter but not doing anything about it are journalists. They serve a very valuable purpose and doing it the way they do, and they should do that. But the rest of us must also be involved, each in our own way, as individuals, as groups of individuals, institutions, and teams of institutions. So, with that, let me go ahead. So, the question really is how scientists strengthen the foundations of um, our society and can act towards a purpose. So, how can we have scientists with a purpose? And then, how priorities are identified, framed, and acted upon, and how top down do we get a purpose for science? So, the ingredients for success and failure in science are complicated. And we all too often, particularly in fundamental research institutions, look upon science as some kind of a linear process towards um, paying our dues to our taxpayers, where we do basic research, someone else takes it to development, someone else takes it to applications, and industry takes it on, and we don't have any responsibility to what happens downstream. As Pernod von Braun said, his job was to send it up. Where it lands is not his worry. Now, things couldn't be more different in reality. From science to application and back is in Western nomenclature a pretzel. In our nomenclature, I would add stickiness to it and call it a jalebi. And the factors which affect science are politics, the economy, various crises such as the pandemic, The processes, on one hand, as taxpayers, we demand intense processes and accountability. As scientists, we wear a different hat and want flexibility and liberation from these processes. How do you balance that? Then there's culture, our approach to science, the questions we ask, what we do. And of course, there are institutions and people, how we build them and how we manage. So these are all very important parameters. Now, the instruments of science, technology, and policy. By the way, I'm moving my phone around. That's why the video keeps changing, and there's a problem with my laptop camera. So the instruments of science, technology, and policy and delivery, let's look at it from a period from 2004 to 2014. In 2004, we had the formation of the Science Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. And that was initiated by C.N.R. Rao. C.N.R. Rao, who just turned 90 a few days ago, was also continued with his lab and his research intensely. He didn't formally join the government. And at that time, there was also other agencies dealing with science policy and planning. There was a planning commission headed by Montek Ahluwalia and had Kasturi Rangan, Dr. Kasturi Rangan, as a member of science. There was a science advisory committee to the cabinet headed by Dr. Chidambaram, the knowledge commission headed by Sam Petroda, the innovation commission headed by Ramesh Mashelkar, the science advisory council, which I just mentioned. Then, of course, you had the executing ministries, the science ministries, such as DAE, DRDO, DOS, and others, apart from the DST and the DBT. And you had the Ministry of Higher Education, of Human Resource Development, as it is called. So you can imagine the numbers of people involved, but one important feature was in terms of execution, as distinct from deciding what to do or what needs to be done or what the country needs and so on. There wasn't one place where you could go to. If a Martian were to land and said, say, take me to your leader, there would be a difficult job to get done. But C.N.R. Rao actually took that leadership position on without any formal requirement to do so, unlike many of the others, and took not only a perspective on what needs to be done, but in a manner typical to him, took on the job of pushing the executive agencies to take up and do various kinds of things which the Science Advisory Council to the Prime Minister recommended. So the Science Advisory Council meetings were very intense. They met once a month. They met at different locations, typically in science institutions and universities. And they addressed one topic very deeply in each meeting. And there was a follow-up on a decision on each topic. And this was extremely intense and very different from what the other agencies were doing. They did that in their own way. I'm not saying that they didn't, but in a way, again, characteristic of C.N.R. Rao, there was an intensity to get things done and an urgency to get things done, which was not seen elsewhere, quite frankly. So what got done? There were several things which got done, and I don't have time to go into that. Those of you of a certain age will know. Some of the things didn't work out well, others worked out well. There was the nano mission, the ISERs were started, the Science, Engineering and Research Board was started, meant to be like the National Science Foundation, but subsumed into the DST in a manner which became SERB. And now, I'll come to later, the NRF is trying to revive the concept of an independent National Science Foundation-like structure. Many global alliances were made in high energy physics, in astronomy, in biology, and these were, now we're beginning to see the impact of all of these, and they're truly important and transformative. One characteristic of committees, and that was exemplified by the discussion on ISERs, is that when the idea of ISERs, which Govind Swarup and some others had been talking about, came up, C.N.R. Rao, very actively supported it and took it up and got it done. And in the Science Advisory Council, which had about 10 members and all the secretaries to the Government of India, relevant ones as invitees, how many do you think jumped up and widely supported this idea? The answer is near zero. and that shows the importance of a chair in getting it done. And now, if you go back and ask all those members what they thought about starting ISIS, all of them are wildly enthusiastic. It also points to another characteristic of committees, which is to regress to the mean always in your decision making. But if some other decision is taken and it succeeds, take credit for it later on. That's a human characteristic, something to be kept in mind. Now, in 2014, a different approach started taking place. The government thought that it would be good to evolve a strategy, a plan for how to grow the Indian economy going ahead in a very big way. And so there were discussions about evolving a strategy. And very soon after the government came into office, there was a meeting which the Prime Minister called of all secretaries to the Government of India. And then after that meeting, divided the secretaries into groups of secretaries, agnostic to the departments they came from, so that they could meet and deliberate on different kinds of issues according to what their group was supposed to look at. So you had a mix of secretaries looking at specific issues, and there was another group of secretaries afterwards who looked at things in a more specialized way, and I'll come to that. So the first group had all these 8 different areas to study. I won't go into that, but you can see that there are, multiple areas, but science is not a specific independent area, but actually comes into every one. So the science secretaries were there in every single sector in some way, giving their inputs into all these areas. Now, these were taken, these discussions, these decisions were taken, and then brought to another group of secretaries, which were called the same set in another round of meetings, called the sectoral group of secretaries. And those groups were in these sectors: agriculture, transport, energy, health, education and social development, finance and corporate affairs, commerce and industry, science and technology, governance and crisis management. So the science and technology group had people from science and technology, all the secretaries and their officers, and they met every evening after working hours and on weekends and discussed what kinds of areas of science and technology need to grow in a completely broad manner. Similarly for commerce, industry, finance, and so on. Now, these groups of secretaries then gave their recommendations to the Prime Minister in a meeting where everyone was there. And the groups were then asked to actually not just be ones formulating ideas on what to do, but also be in charge of implementation. So the chair of each group of secretaries and those science secretaries, in this case, were asked to go ahead and work out methodologies for implementing these suggestions which they came up with. So broadly, and I, again, in the interest of time, keep it very brief, there were 4 levels of directions which the secretaries recommended. One was to increase opportunities and access in every way at the early levels in school and science, at the higher levels in science education, in fundamental research, and in research institutions and universities, and so on. The second was to stimulate greatly the startup ecosystem to increase jobs. The third was to break the barriers between our science institutions in multiple locations so that they could work with each other in a location and between locations, and then to take on major missions nationally. And that's basically the summary of what went on over the next, those 5 years and the next 5 years in terms of what the science technology strategy was. There was also a suggestion for something which was then used as an acronym, but not later, which is called Sustainable Progress through Application of Research and Knowledge, a coordination system of all the science agencies so that there could be one point of call for looking at what everyone is doing, not from an executive perspective, but from a knowledge perspective, so that different people could work together, different agencies could work together. And that was, in some aspects, those goals have been met modestly, but that remains, the ability to work together remains a major challenge. Then the synergy between labs in different cities was again a major aspect. You may not some of you may be aware, there are about, for example, 39 laboratories in Hyderabad which are funded by the government of India, and most of them don't know of the existence of the others. And the idea was that if these people could share both intellectual and material resources, they could work together much better. And similarly, in other major centers of investment. Now, one of the suggestions was to create a national science and technology authority, which reports to the prime minister, was nimble, had quality staff, had both a convergence arm of aggregating all what was going on in the science and technology space, linked to an application arm, and was an overarching body with a light touch, nagging, as it were, of different agencies and institutions to get their acts together and closely interact with the center and states. Now, it also recommended this group of secretaries three major missions: a deep ocean mission, a climate and environment mission, and a cyber physical mission. The first and the last have been started and are making progress. The second one is started more in a distributed way, and that needs more coordination, in my view. In 2018, this idea of Spark matured into the formation of the Prime Minister's Science, Technology and Innovation Council, which took on some of those missions and these missions, which I highlight over here, in natural language translation, which the Ministry of IT has pushed and worked with industry to push that area in a substantial manner. The quantum mission has now been announced as a major electric vehicles mission. Waste to wealth mission is taking off, not as fast as it should because of the numbers of players involved. The deep ocean mission has moved. There's the innovation ecosystem has been substantially stimulated, and there's a mission on green hydrogen which has been started, which is also has a major research component. Now, the reason I mention these is that these are away from the traditional view which many of us in basic science institutions have about what science and technology is about, and this addresses a much larger ecosystem. Each of these have major fundamental research as well as application-oriented opportunities, and there are several more which I won't go through. Some of which are collaborative in astronomy and others in high energy physics, yet others collaborative in biology and so on. Okay, now there was also an idea that there should be better integration. And the idea of the research clusters in different cities linked to a start, but has taken off rather well after that, particularly in Delhi, in Pune, in Bhubaneswar, in Chandigarh, to some extent in Bangalore. These clusters have started working together. They've formed Section 8 companies, and they're both attracting funding for fundamental to application research, as more importantly, coordinating projects. Not as much as they could do, but it's better than not having anything, and there's a potential for really big takeoff over there. The space sector, as also the geospatial sector, many of you may be aware, has been reformed greatly by the creation of InSpace, a organization which interacts with the outside world on one side and opens up ISRO's facilities on the other, changing ISRO into a fundamental research organization and a provider of its facilities to the outside world, and not as an organization which launches and uses and decides what others will use. So there needs to be a demand from the user, whether it's government or the private sector, and ISRO becomes increasingly a provider of high-end facilities and resources to enable the broad ecosystem. And this has really resulted in a boom in the space innovation sector rather substantially, and hopefully with similar opening up in each in their own way in atomic energy and defense, big research inputs which were cloistered can now be opened up into the broader ecosystem. So let's see how that goes. So finally, I'll end with the National Research Foundation. As I said, there have been many attempts, and this attempt too has gone on. The idea was to have an independent organization which looks at research across humanities and social sciences and supports it both to expand the footprint of science as well as to take on high-end, high-quality projects and programs. So fundamentally, the reason is all of you who are in rich institutions, 90% of our research funds go to institutions like yours, and 10% of our students go to institutions such as yours and mine. 90% of our students go to institutions where only 10% of our resources go to. So the National Research Foundation aims to broaden that footprint, but also not to do it just by a spray and pray approach, but in a more considered manner. How that happens remains to be seen. But there's one guarantee that it will fail if none of you participate, and there's a small chance it will succeed if you participate. So it's critically important that all of us participate. These are very complex challenges, very difficult missions, and we need to see how best we can make these kinds of ventures succeed. There will always be some points which could be done better. Each one of us will have different views. Today we have what we have, and we must make sure that we get all the resources in place to do this. This has got about 10,000 crores of additional funds, which is substantial for 5 years, which is substantial. Remember that the SDRB's fund is about 1,000 crores. So it's double that for 5 years from the government. And the goal is to raise about 35,000 crores from industry funding into research, which is a big challenge. But it looks like I'm pleasantly surprised to see that there are trends which suggest that that will happen. And the SARB system will continue, as will other funding agencies undisturbed. So that this really gives that was the to liberate the government, industry, and academia to work with each other. So finally, we have an opportunity to partner our vast research infrastructure with our university network. On the left, you have our research institutions. And, coincidentally, I've been visiting many of them all over India for other work last few months. And it's amazing to see both the extraordinary infrastructure and the quality of scientists in these institutions. If there's one big problem with our institutions, I would say, including math science, including NCBS and others, that each of them is pretty much a short walk from India. We draw from the rest of India, but we are not giving back sufficiently. Now, it could be argued that we are doing our job, giving back is someone else's job, and that's pretty much the starting point. I said, the country and the world is going through a very, very difficult stage, and those kinds of, statements which dissociate us from doing are simply not on. We must get involved. And if we get involved, then we can link these 600 institutions with these 13,000, 14,000 universities and colleges, make us open as facilities for these places, and make a venture such as the National Research Foundation succeed. Will that happen? Very difficult. It's a very difficult challenge. It's not easy. It's a big task. But as a Chinese general once said, if it's a long haul and a big task, the time to start is now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Vijay Raghavan, for this nice talk. As usual, you are very inspiring. The floor is now open to questions. Before I let others ask a question, I had a question. A few years back, I had attended a Max Planck Partner Group head meeting, and you were there, and you had mentioned that the government is trying to come up with schemes which will encourage, young faculty to or postdocs to first join research institutes like Math Science, NCBS, but in later years move to a university and contribute to much more societal building. So, is there any move in that direction?
So, that's a very important route to take. And my view, which is, difficult to implement, is the following. That I think going forward, in new times, as opposed to earlier times, high-end, high-quality research institutions should be a temporary parking space so that you can get your research agenda and get started and do it well. And then it's best that we move on to the university system in multiple ways. There are different ways possible. This is the model, for example, the European Molecular Biology Laboratories have. Most of their staff, their faculty, stay on for about a 5+4 year period and move on to the university system. and there's a very small percentage, 10%, who stay honest and are people. So that's a very important model. And these kinds of changes, to be very frank, unless we start developing them from within, they will come from outside in a clunky manner, which we will all criticize. And these are things which we have talked about for a long time. So we should start doing these things. So that's a very important point. Now, that said, there's also another very important task that we need to do, which is to make sure that our university system is attractive to move. But given the distribution of labs I showed you and the distribution of universities I showed you, there should not be a big problem if universities are attractive and their ability to hire people in a variety of ways, despite all the bureaucratic norms and procedures, are made easy. It is possible that we have this move. I'm very inspired by the Inter-University Center for Astronomy and Astrophysics. As a center, it's fantastic in a university environment, but it could be more organically connected to the University of Pune and allow people to move out into the university. So those are the kinds of models we need to look at. Sorry for the long answer.
Thank you very much for the kind answer. Any further questions? If not, let's thank Professor Vijay Raghavan for this wonderful talk again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have a small memento which we will be keeping a surprise and passing it on to your office and
Beam it up.
LCBS.
You can beam it up.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So with that,
Thank you.
Thank you.